Meditations on the Tarot, Letter 12, The Hanged Man, Part 2. I have moved away from the subject of the concrete state of the man who lives under the law of celestial gravitation. Let us return to this. Two things characterize the state of the spiritual man, that he is suspended and that he is upside down. Here is what Saint Teresa says about the first characteristic trait. The soul seems to me to be in this state when no comfort comes to it from heaven, and it is not there itself, and when it desires none from the earth, and is not there either. Then it is as if crucified between heaven and earth, suffering and receiving no help from either. The Life of Saint Teresa of Avila, page 140. The soul is suspended between heaven and earth. It experiences complete solitude. For here it is no longer a matter of ordinary solitude where one is alone in the world, but rather of complete solitude where one is alone because one is outside of the world, the celestial as well as the terrestrial world. Transported thus into this desert, it seems that the soul can certainly, in all truth, say with the royal prophet, "I lie awake, I am like a lonely bird on the housetop." Psalm 102:7. It is possible that King David was experiencing this same loneliness when he wrote these words. This verse comes to my mind at these times in such a way that it seems to be fulfilled in me. It is a comfort to me to know that others have felt these extremes of loneliness, and an even greater comfort that they have been people of such quality. The Life of Saint Teresa, page 139. This is the 0 point between the fields of terrestrial and celestial gravitation. It is from there that the soul either is elevated in contemplation of divine and celestial things, or descends to act in the human and terrestrial domain. But this 0 point is certainly the place of its permanent sojourn. After elevation or after the accomplishment of an act, it returns there. The solitude of the desert between the two worlds is its abode. The other characteristic trait of the spiritual man is that he is upside down. This means to say, firstly, that the solid ground under his feet is found above, whilst the ground below is only the concern and perception of the head. Secondly, it means to say that his will is connected with heaven, and is found in immediate contact, not only by the intermediary of thought and feeling, with the spiritual world. This is in such a way that his will knows things that the head, his thinking, still does not know, so that it is the future, the celestial designs for the future, which work in and through his will, rather than experience and memory of the past. He is therefore literally the man of the future, the final cause being the element activating his will. He is the man of desire, in the sense of the Book of Daniel and in the sense of Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, i.e. the man whose will is set high above the powers of the head, above thought, imagination and memory. Now, the normal relationship between thought, feeling and the will for a civilized and educated man is such that his thought awakens feeling and directs the will. Thought plays a stimulating role by means of imagination towards feeling, and an educative role by means of imagination and feeling towards the will. Having to act, one thinks, one imagines, one feels, and, lastly, one desires and acts. This is not so for the spiritual man. For him it is the will which plays the stimulating and educative role towards feeling and thought. He acts first, then he desires, then he feels the worth of his action, and lastly he understands. Abraham left his country of birth and went, in crossing the desert, into a strange country where, centuries later, a people descended from him was to find its native land, and where, several centuries later on, the work of mankind's salvation was to take place. Did he know all this? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that he acted as if he knew, his will being enamored with these future things, and by their greatness and significance. No, in the sense that he did not have in his thoughts and imagination a plan or clear program concerning how, when, and through what stages precisely these things would be realized. The certainty which in the first place takes hold of the will, from whence it takes its effect on feeling and thought, is precisely what the Apostle Paul understood by the expression faith, pistis or fides. According to him, faith is the firm assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place which he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was to go. Hebrews 11:1-8. Abraham had therefore had the firm assurance of things hoped for, after having experienced the conviction of things not seen, i.e. his will knew, whilst his mind and imagination did not see, or did not have the kind of assurance proper to them. All the same, he obeyed and left without knowing where he was going, i.e. he acted before his thought and imagination had understood the whole world implied in his action. When he left, therefore, his head followed his feet. His feet were then above, in so far as they experienced the commandment of heaven, and his head obeyed them and was turned below, in so far as it saw nothing but the privations, risks, and perils of the enterprise. Abraham therefore found himself precisely in the condition of the hanged man of our Arcanum. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called. Here is the key to the mystery of faith, or knowledge of the will. Obeyed when he was called. The will is an active force. It is not naturally an organ of perception. In order for it to be able to perceive, it must not become passive, for then it would fall asleep or fade away, because its very nature is activity, and in ceasing to be active it would cease to be will. No, it should change centre of gravitation, i.e. to transform my will into thy will. It is the inner act of love alone which can accomplish the change of centre that the will uses or around which it gravitates. Instead of gravitating around the centre me, it can orientate itself towards the centre you. This transformation effected by love is what one calls obedience. Now, it is through obedience that the will is able to perceive. What it is able to perceive or be infused with is revelation from above, which inspires, directs, and strengthens. It is thus that the will of a martyr can sustain anything, and that the will of a thaumaturgist can accomplish everything. Abraham's divine call was such an act of infused revelation, and he obeyed, says the Apostle. It is nevertheless necessary to add here that he obeyed even before his departure, for the divine call itself presupposes obedience, the transcendentalization of the will which renders the will capable of receiving a divine call from above. For the will must already be in a state of obedience in order for it to be able to perceive the inspiration or intuition from above, and to receive the imprint of the divine call, i.e. the gift of faith. Faith as a supernatural gift, which is the case here, is not the same thing as the natural, rational, and morally founded confidence that one has in an authority. The confidence that one puts in a doctor, judge, or priest is only natural. In fact, it is rational and in accordance with human justice to recognize the authority of experienced experts, and hence to place one's trust in them. Saint Teresa had complete confidence in her confessors, who nevertheless were mistaken about the serious question of the source of her mystical, Gnostic, and magical experiences, notably whether they had their origin from God or from a demon. But in the conflict between supernatural faith and natural confidence, which took place in her when her confessors, and also theologians of authority, declared that her spiritual experiences originated from a demon, it was faith which prevailed. For it was a conflict between the immediate and authentic divine action on the will, and the confidence of human thought and feeling in an authority who is only a second-hand source. It was not only in her that the authentic divine revelation prevailed, but also it brought the confessors and theologians in question to recognize its authenticity. The raptures of Saint Teresa were those of faith, i.e. the union of the will with God, which left behind the other powers of the soul, namely thought and imagination. Here is what she says concerning this. I can only say that the soul conceives itself to be near God, and that it is left with such a conviction that it cannot possibly help believing. All the faculties, thought, imagination, memory, are in abeyance, and so suspended, as I have said, that their operations cannot be followed. If the soul has previously been meditating on any subject, it vanishes from the memory at once, as completely as if it had never been thought of. If it has been reading, it is unable to remember it or dwell on the words, and it is the same with vocal prayer. So the restless little moth of memory has its wings burned, and it can flutter no more. The will must be fully occupied in loving, but does not understand how it loves. If it understands, it does not understand how it understands, or at least cannot comprehend anything of what it understands. I do not think that it understands at all, because, as I have said, it does not understand itself. Nor can I myself understand this. Let it be observed, too, that however long the soul may enjoy this suspension of the faculties, the actual time is, in my opinion, very short. Half an hour would be a very long period of rapture, longer, I think, than any I ever experienced. Actually, it is very difficult to judge the time, since the senses are in abeyance. But I do not think that it can ever be long before one of them recovers. It is the will that maintains the contact. But the other two faculties soon begin to trouble it once more. But as the will is calm, they become suspended again, and they are quiet for a little longer. But eventually they spring into life again. In this way some hours may be, and are, spent in prayer. For once the two faculties have begun to grow drunk on the taste of this wine, they are very ready to give themselves up again in order to enjoy some more. Then they keep company with the will, and the three rejoice together. The Lives of Saint Teresa, pages 126 to 127. The will, united with God, and the two other faculties suspended, is the state of the soul in receiving the supernatural gift of faith, and it is certainly the faith thus experienced which triumphed for Saint Teresa over scruples due to the confidence that she bore towards the theologians. The state of soul described by Saint Teresa corresponds overall still more to the condition of the hanged man of our Arcanum. For, like him, the soul of Saint Teresa was upside down, i.e., where the will precedes the head, understanding and memory, and is raised above it. The will then receives the divine imprint that the head at some time will understand, or not. Now, practical Hermeticism has the aspiration that the two other powers keep company with the will at the moment when this latter is in the state of complete obedience towards the divine, i.e., it aspires to the realization of the last sentence of the above quoted text. Then they, the two other powers, keep company with the will, and the three rejoice together. Let us add, the three rejoice together in the joy of union, knowledge, and the future realization of this experience, Hermeticism being a totality comprising mysticism, gnosis, and divine magic. Practical Hermeticism therefore applies itself to educating thought and imagination, or memory, to keep in step with the will. This is why it requires constant effort of thought and imagination combined in order to think, meditate, and contemplate in symbols, symbolism being the sole means of rendering thought and imagination capable of not being suspended when the will submits to revelation from above, and enabling them to unite with it in its act of receptive obedience, so that the soul not only has a revelation of faith, but also participates in this revelation with its understanding and memory. This is the principal point of practical Hermeticism, and at the same time its contribution to Christian mysticism. I say Christian mysticism and not Christian mystical theology, because theology rationalizes the material of mystical experience in deriving rules and laws, whilst Hermeticism wants thought and imagination to participate in this experience. Its aim is found in the experience itself, not in the domain of explaining it or accounting for it. Meanwhile, the Hermeticist is also a hanged man. For him, too, faith predominates at the beginning, and for a long time subsequently. This is because it is a difficult task, exacting inner asceticism for a long time, to render thought and imagination capable of being present and upright by the altar where the fire of faith is kindled and burns. But with time, the gap between the certainty of faith and that of knowledge becomes narrower and narrower. Thought and imagination become more and more capable of participating in the revelation of faith to the will, until the day arrives when they participate in it on equal footing with the will. This is then the spiritual event that is designated Hermetic initiation. Thus I know a man who, being a soldier in the White Army and having been unjustly accused by 2 officers of the Allied Marines, understood in the space of an instant of time the relationship which exists between eternity and the instant. This was a lightning flash received from above, both through the will and through thought and imagination. The 3 powers of the soul were taken hold of and illumined by it simultaneously. Authentic Hermeticism can therefore never be in contradiction with authentic faith. It can contradict only the opinions of theologians, i.e. not the faith but the confidence that is borne towards the statements of theologians. The strange thing is that theologians are as a rule very modest and even humble people, but from the moment that they sit in the chair of their science and drape themselves with the mantle of its primary and secondary conclusions, and, above all, the general consensus, they change and are no longer recognizable. From the modest people that they are, they change all of a sudden into sources of divine oracles. This is because their science is the most pretentious of all sciences that exist, being interpretive of the absolute truth of revelation. In contrast, the representatives of the natural sciences are, as a rule, very pretentious people, but the discipline of their science renders them modest. This is because their science is modest, being interpretive of the relative truth of experience. Thus we have a paradox. Modest people become pretentious thanks to their science, and pretentious people become modest again thanks to their science. The danger for the one is knowing too much, the danger for the other is to know nothing. Thus, from the mouth of one of its conscientious representatives, the physiologist Dubois-Reymond, empirical science declared itself ignoramus et ignorabimus, we do not know and we shall never know, with regard to the 7 enigmas, or Welträtsel of the world. 1. The essence of matter and energy. 2. The origin of motion. 3. The origin of the senses, or sense perception. 4. The question of free will. 5. The origin of life. 6. The purposeful organization of nature. 7. The origin of thought and language. E. H. Dubois-Reymond, Über die Grenzen des Naturerkennens. On the other hand, there is complete certainty for certain theologians not only with regard to the above enigmas, but also with respect to the destiny of the soul after the death of the body, and to what then is or is not possible. Thus we read, at its departure from the body, the soul is no longer in a position to change its moral orientation, nor to go back on its previous adherence to sin, but, on the contrary, it fixes itself in the disposition of will found at the precise instant of death. It becomes henceforth inflexible, and rebels against every idea of retraction, conversion, or repentance. Page 1392. And eternal punishment exists only in the function of the eternal perseverance of the perverse disposition of unrepentance on departing from the present life. Page 394. Cardinal Louis Billon, Etudes 392 and 394. Accordingly, it is therefore the body and not the soul which bears within it the possibility of changing its moral orientation, going back on adherence to sin, being converted and repenting. It is therefore the precise instant of death and not the totality of earthly life which determines for all eternity the moral disposition of the soul, and therefore its eternal destiny. The body dying, the soul at the instant of death is thus made to depart like a rocket with a prefixed program, a preset rocket program for eternity. The mercy of God therefore acts only at the instant of death of the body, the destiny of the soul subsequently being only a semi-mechanical deployment of the soul's disposition at the instant of its departure from the body. These are undoubtedly monstrous conclusions. It is evident, however, that if the conscientious Dubois-Reymond is too timid and, in consequence of this fact, opens the door to scepticism, the zealous theologian is, in contrast, rash, and as a consequence of this fact, opens the doors to unbelief. For it is impossible to believe simultaneously Cardinal Billot's statement and that of the Gospel, which says, if a man has 100 sheep, and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the hills and go in search of the one that went astray? So it is the will of my Father who is in heaven, that not one of his little ones should perish. Matthew 18:12-14. One is bound to believe either that the mercy of God is limited, i.e. that it extends only to the instant of bodily death, or that it is infinite and never ceases, i.e. that it possesses the means of acting also after the instant of the soul's separation from the body. Here the love, no, the very justice of God is in question. Du Bois-Reymond ought to have said, "Being given the methods of contemporary science and the faculties of knowledge known up to the present time, the 7 great world enigmas seem to be insoluble. But if the methods and faculties of knowledge change at some time without losing their scientific character, it could be otherwise with the enigmas in question." And would it not be better if Cardinal Billot had said, "In the Scriptures there are passages relating to the love of God and to the chastisement of sin which, given the present character of our reasoning and moral sentiment, seem to be contradictory. As it is impossible for them to be really contradictory, I have formed a personal opinion which seems to me to reconcile them in a satisfactory way. But I do not know if it is the only possible solution to the problem, or whether there are other and better ones. What is nevertheless certain is that freedom exists, and that it entails the risk of eternal hell, whatever the exact sense of the word eternal may be, this being a dogma of the faith. With respect to the mechanism of the realization of this truth, I have the following opinion." And then he could give his opinion that earthly life is the domain of freedom, whilst the other world is that of fate, an opinion that he would still have to defend against pertinent arguments in favour of the contrary thesis. Now, practical Hermeticism is, like Christian mysticism, based on the experience of authentic faith, i.e. the experience of the human being upside down, where the will is above intellectuality and imagination. Its practical aim is nevertheless to render the intellect and imagination equal companions of the will favoured by revelation from above. And here is how this is to be achieved. One moralizes thought in substituting moral logic for formal logic. One makes an entrance for moral warmth in the domain of cold thought. At the same time, one intellectualizes the imagination by disciplining it and submitting it to the laws of moral logic. This is what Goethe understood by exact imagination, exact Fantasie, i.e. dispensing with imagination which plays according to free and arbitrary association, and instead applying it to work in accordance with the associations dictated by moral logic, in harmony with the laws of symbolism. It is thus that thought and imagination become capable of being attentive to and participating in the experience of the will receiving favours from above. The statement, "one moralizes thought in substituting moral logic for formal logic," could be said to be very concise and calls for an amplification. It means to say that formal logic, whether explicitly or implicitly operating with syllogistic forms, is not important. Cedes its function as the supreme court of appeal to the moral logic of conscience. Syllogistic logic operates with forms of syllogisms, where 2 suppositions together constitute a common implication, and where the conclusion comprises that which is implied. Thus the logic of Caiaphas's argument, which persuaded the assembly of the Sanhedrin to make a decision against Jesus Christ, was impeccable from the point of view of formal logic, but was at the same time a great violation of moral logic. "It is expedient for you that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation should not perish." John 11:50. This was Caiaphas's argument. This argument is based on the logical principle that the part is less than the whole, the part being one man and the whole being the nation. Being faced with the alternative, if we let him go, all will believe in him, and the Romans will come to destroy our city and nation, the decision was taken to sacrifice the part for the whole. For moral logic, however, the quantitative principle that the part is less than the whole is not valid in a general sense. There are distinctions to be made. For already in a living organism, where it is not the size but rather the importance of the vital function which counts, the principle in question would be, the part is equal to the whole. Because, for example, the heart, which is only a small part of the whole human organism, cannot be sacrificed without sacrificing the life of the whole organism. And in the moral and spiritual domain, where it is only quality which counts, one righteous man is worth more than the whole nation, if it is a question not of voluntary sacrifice, but rather of the one who must be sacrificed. Thus, in the spiritual and moral domain, the above logical principle can be transformed into its opposite formula: the part is greater than the whole. Here is an example, therefore, of the operation of moral logic, or concrete and qualitative logic, quite different from formal and quantitative logic. It is the conflict between the logic of the Logos and that of this world, which the Apostle Paul spoke of when he said, "They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering over deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth." Hebrews 11:37-38. Moral logic is the human analogy of that of the Logos that enlightens every man coming into the world, John 1:9. It is the logic of faith, i.e. the logic of thought which participates in the revelation accorded to the will. Moral logic introduces warmth into the light of thought, so that the latter becomes solar instead of lunar, which is what it is when it has only light alone and is cold, without warmth. One intellectualizes the imagination by disciplining it and submitting it to the laws of moral logic. This means to say that a kind of asceticism should be applied to the life of imagination in order to transform its arbitrary play into work inspired and directed from above. Here symbolism plays the leading role, one which is both preparatory and educational. For symbolism is simultaneously imaginative and logical, i.e. logical according to moral logic. Thus the arcana of the tarot with which we are occupied constitute a practical school of education for the imagination, with a view to rendering it capable of participating on an equal footing with solarized thought and zodiacalized will in the revelation from above. It is then intellectualized, i.e. it loses the feverish warmth which is normal for it and becomes luminous. It is selenized and becomes lunar, just as the intellect was before its solarization by moral logic. The prayer that is made for souls in purgatory, "Locum refrigerii, lucis e pacis dona eis Domine," give to them, O Lord, a place of refreshment, light and peace, expresses well that it is necessary for the imagination to become reflecting instead of fantasizing. The zodiacalization of the will, the solarization of thought, and the selenization or lunarization of imagination. We have chosen these three terms to signify the voluntary sacrifice of the soul's powers to heaven, means to say that the will becomes an organ of perception and execution towards God, as the zodiac is in the macrocosm, that thought becomes both warm and luminous, as the sun is in the macrocosm, that lastly the imagination becomes reflecting towards truth, as the moon is towards the sun in the macrocosm. It is a matter, therefore, of sacrificing the three powers of the soul to heaven. This sacrifice is nothing other than the three traditional and universal vows, that of obedience or the sacrifice of the will, that of poverty or the sacrifice of thought, and that of chastity or the sacrifice of imagination. It is thus that the will, thought, and imagination become reflectors of the revelation from above, instead of being instruments of human arbitrariness. This means to say, in terms of esoteric psychophysiology, that the disposition of the crown center, or the eight-petaled lotus, which is always beyond the reach of human arbitrariness, and which is constantly in a state of divine repose, i.e., which is always at the disposal of heaven, extends to the other centers or lotuses. One after the other they withdraw from the influence of human arbitrariness and immerse themselves in divine repose, i.e., they become organs of pure revelation. The entire human psychophysiological organization thus becomes a divine instrument. Saintliness is achieved when all 7, or 8 in rare cases, centers are entirely at the disposal of heaven. The degrees of saintliness, from the point of view of the human psychophysiological organization, depend on how many and which centers are at the disposal of heaven. With respect to Hermeticists, They do not, as a rule, attain to complete saintliness, where all 7 centres are put at the disposal of the divine, since their work and mission, if there is a mission, entails and exacts efforts and labours which presuppose the preservation of human initiative, i.e. that at least the frontal centre, the 2-petalled lotus, remains at the disposal of the freedom, should the case arise, of human arbitrariness. I say at least the 2-petalled lotus remains at the disposal of the individual, because it is the centre of intellectual initiative. It can certainly be taken hold of by revelation from above for some time, instants, minutes, even hours. But, as a rule, for the Hermeticists, this must remain at his discretion. Indeed, it would be very distressing for him to be able to think only what is caused from above, and to turn his intellectual gaze only towards what is determined from above. I know a man who had thus lost the use of his centre of intellectual initiative, which is at the same time that of the direction of attention, and who, being a Hermeticist, suffered very much from this. He was able to comprehend very many great things, above all things of general significance, but he was as if paralyzed concerning his personal problems. He was not able to think about what he wanted to, nor to direct his attention to what he wanted to see and understand. This lasted some time, until use of the centre in question was restored to him by the intervention of a benefactor from above. I would recommend people who have similar or identical difficulties to address themselves to the Holy Archangel Michael, who is, it seems to me, a very special friend and protector of the kind of Hermeticists that I have in view in these letters, i.e. people who want to unite saintliness and initiation, or who aspire to a Hermeticism that is holy and blessed from above.